Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome back to the other side of lunch. Congratulations. I am very happy to welcome you to the Right to Counsel panel that we're going to have a really fantastic panel talk about the inequalities in criminal defense. But before we get to that, I want to remind you that we have CLE available. And if you need CLE, please make sure that you get scanned at the door by one of our volunteers so that we can get you into the system. And with that, I will turn it over to our really fantastic panel and our moderator, Josie.
Hi. My name is Josie Duffy Rice. I am the president of The Appeal. We're an outlet that covers criminal justice and produces original criminal justice journalism. And I live here in Atlanta. And I am so excited to be here with this panel. I've been nervous about it all week, which is a testament to how wonderful both of you are. I'm going to let you all introduce yourselves, but I thought I would give a short introduction and then pass it over to you, Stephen, and then I'll pass it over to you. So Stephen Breit is a visiting lecturer at Yale Law School and a professor of law at Georgia State, and the founder and former executive director of the Southern Center for Human Rights. And Jarrett Adams is a lawyer whose law offices are called the Law Offices of Jarrett Adams. Lawyers are known for our creativity and our who is from Wisconsin and has a story that he's going to talk to you all about, but his own experiences in the criminal justice system, but especially dealing with public defense in particular. And now he represents clients and has worked with the Wisconsin Innocence Project to represent wrongfully convicted clients as well. I'm going to let them both introduce themselves, and then we're going to get into the substance of the panel.
That's fine. I'll give it.
Okay, great.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I'm really delighted to be with Jarrett because how many years ago was it? We were at the ACS meeting in Washington, and I called him up out of the audience, and he had just been exonerated, and I think we were about to clerk for the judge in the very court that granted habeas corpus relief. Yes. And so we have been friends ever since, and I've watched his career. I know he's got a law office in New York, and soon going to have a law office in Chicago, his home. And it's really exciting to see that development, and I'm glad to see him here. I've, since 1979, primarily been representing people in death penalty cases all across the South, based in Atlanta, and teaching since about 1993. And let me just start out by saying, as I've gone around the South and the work that I've done, I go to courthouses all over, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, wherever it may be, and you go into courthouses where it looks like a slave ship has docked outside the courthouse. All of these African-American men brought in to the courtroom in leg irons and chained from their wrists to their ankles, wearing orange jumpsuit, totally degrading way to appear in court. Some places where I go, people even wear the old-fashioned stripes, the black and white stripes. Looks like 1920 or something when these people are hobbled in. And then you'll see, after they're seated in the jury box in the first couple of rows, a lawyer comes in and goes along and talks to them. Of course, these are not confidential conversations because there's a person handcuffed on either side of the people they're talking to. But they'll go down the line and they'll go through the jury box and whatever, and then a short time later, the judge will take the bench. And at that point, everybody will plead guilty and will be sentenced. If you're in court today, the free world people come in, the courtroom will be packed, sort of like this room. And the public defender will come in and talk to the whole audience and say, now, in a few minutes, I want you all to go over in the other courtroom here that's not being used. But basically, it's the same thing. And there are two or three public defenders. They meet with people. Short time later, the judge takes the bench and they plead. Meet them and plead them. And everybody who's there, the judge, the lawyers, the prosecutor, the defense lawyer, the people in the audience, the parents, the families, everybody knows that this is a complete charade. There's been no interview in any kind of serious attorney-client interview. There's been no examination of the legal issues that might be at play in the case. There's been no investigation of what the prosecution's case is. Maybe they looked at a police report, but probably not when you're handling that many people. And the whole thing is just a complete charade, and this is still taking place. And it's not just in the South. I saw a deposition of a lawyer in California. He said he handled 70% of his cases with 30-second interviews with his clients in guilty pleas. That seems awfully short to me, but that's what he said under oath in a deposition. And so, obviously, this is a complete farce when you have this. And of course, that's not everywhere. And one of the things that I think makes it a little tough talking about this subject is there are 50 states, and there are a lot of different courts in different states. There are municipal courts, there are juvenile courts, misdemeanor courts, adult courts. This is on the state side. And of course, federal, won't talk much about the federal because that's a different situation. Only 5% of the cases are handled in federal court, and the federal defenders tend to be the sort of gold standard of public defenders. But I'm talking about in the state courts. A lot of people think that everywhere we have public defenders these days. We still have lots of places that don't have public defender offices. We have places like Alabama. Most counties in Alabama don't have public defender. We'll see 2 lawyers in Baymonette, Alabama, appointed to represent somebody in a death penalty case, and the trial takes 2 days, and the person's sentenced to death, and there really is almost just a walkthrough. It's a totally perfunctory kind of trial. Let me just talk about 2 or 3 little things that I think are at play here in the places where we need help. I'm not going to talk about the good places. When you go to get your car fixed, you don't talk about all the things that are right about your car. You talk about things that are wrong, the things that need to be fixed. So let's talk about that. Most fundamental right a person has is the right to a lawyer. Everything depends upon that. All your constitutional rights depend upon having a lawyer. Terry Lee Godwin faced the death penalty in Georgia with a lawyer who had never heard of the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. So he was unable to invoke the Fourth Amendment to deal with the search and seizure that took place in that case. That's one of the critical things a lawyer does, the legal knowledge that a lawyer brings. The investigation of the state's case. Is there a case there? The investigation of the defense case. Maybe it's a complete innocence case. Maybe it's a case where the person may be guilty of something but not the thing that they're charged with. But all of those things come to rest on the shoulders of the lawyer. But the issue that is really difficult is how do you enforce the right to counsel? I was involved in a case in Kentucky a few years ago, a guy named Gregory Wilson. And Gregory was assigned a lawyer who was in the twilight of a very undistinguished career in the bar. He had been suspended from practice, and he'd be reinstated. The bar, you get more due process from the bar than anybody gets anywhere else. And he was practicing out of his home. And in his home where he practiced law, there's the Budweiser beer sign on the wall. And just think about it for a minute. If you go into somebody's, quote, law office, quote, living room, and there's a Budweiser beer sign, you might want to ease on down the street and, you know, see if you can't find somebody who's got some books and a little mahogany and tells you they're serious about the practice of law. What really set Gregory Wilson off, though, was when he called the number that the lawyer gave him, and they answered Kelly's Keg. Kelly's Keg was a bar right across the street from the Kenton County Courthouse in Covington, Kentucky. And it worked pretty well. You call that number, and the bartender would summon Mr. Hagdorn to the phone, and he would talk, although often he couldn't remember the conversation the next time he saw Gregory. And so when he goes to court, Gregory Wilson says to the judge, Your Honor, I want another lawyer. I'm facing the death penalty. I'm from Detroit. I'm a black man facing the death penalty. I don't know anybody in this place, but I know one thing. I need a real lawyer, and I don't have a real lawyer. And the judge said, well, Mr. Wilson, you can have any lawyer you want. This court is not going to stand in your way. Have any lawyer you want, but this is your court-appointed lawyer. And unless you can come up with your own lawyer, this is the lawyer you're going to have. I was involved just a month ago in a case in Houston, Texas, where a fellow had been assigned a lawyer that I've actually written about because he's so bad, Jerome Godnich. Missed the statute of limitations for filing for federal habeas corpus relief in 3 different death penalty cases. Clients who were executed without ever having an opportunity to get their case before the federal courts. I was in Dallas a few years after that had happened, and I was on a panel at the ABA with the president of the Texas Bar, and I said, why isn't this man Why hadn't he been suspended from practice at the very least? I mean, some people would say, well, it wouldn't matter. They would have had such bad representation from him in federal court, it would have come out the same way. But if a lawyer can't file their papers on time, that's about as basic as it gets. And the bar, my point was, the bar had a responsibility to suspend this fella or to disbar this fella. Or if the bar wasn't going to do it, the judges in Houston had a responsibility to stop appointing him to cases. That was a number of years ago, and yet last month, here's a guy complaining. He has Jerome Godnich as his lawyer. He's not doing anything. He's never come to see him, never talked to him, never investigated his case. He desperately wants another lawyer. Godnich is handling something like 500 felony cases all at the same time, doing a high-volume practice where he spends almost no time on every case, so he makes a lot of money when you put them all together. It's making something like $300,000 a year that courts in Texas pay you to be bad. A lot of places, the lawyers aren't very good because they don't get paid very much, but he's actually paid quite a bit to be a really bad lawyer. And he complained to the judge, and Judge Martin said, well, you got three choices. You can either keep Mr. Godnich, your lawyer, or you can hire a lawyer, which to him was totally meaningless, fly to the moon. You can fly to the moon if you want to. You couldn't hire a lawyer, you couldn't fly to the moon. Or you can represent yourself. And those were the three choices. Of course, there's a fourth choice. You can have a different lawyer. But that was never explored at all. And unfortunately, when you talk about somebody like that, the representation provided there is not just in one case or those three cases, it's in a huge number of cases because the judges in Houston are appointing this lawyer to case after case after case. And he's giving them all short shrift. And there are a number of other people doing exactly the same thing. And just tell me when I'm 5 more minutes or whatever. Well, I want to talk about one other barrier because I was talking last night with some people, and whether you know this or not, like in a lot of places now, before you can get a public defender, you've got to pay the public defender fee. Hills McGee was a veteran, disabled veteran, came to court in Augusta, Georgia, not too far from here, and they told him it would cost $50 to be represented by a lawyer. Nobody told him that that could be waived. So when they said, well, you have to pay $50, and I don't have $50, so he represented himself. Which just shows you how important it is, back to my earlier point, how important it is to have a lawyer to tell you you can waive the fee and have a lawyer. But he was never told that. So he pled guilty. He was guilty. He'd been drunk and disorderly, really serious crime. And he was fined $270. He couldn't pay that. Couldn't pay $270, but we've got a deal for you, Mr. McGee. We'll put you on the installment plan. We'll put you on probation, and you pay 12 monthly payments. But what they didn't tell him is it'll cost you $15 to enroll with the private probation company. It will cost you $39 a month to have the private probation company take your installment each month. And so after a year, Hills McGee had paid $552 on his $270 fine, the combination of the installments plus the fee to the probation company. He was still owed $186. Believe it or not, he had paid $552. He still owes this money, and he's locked up because he doesn't pay that money. Debtor's prisons, which we at Southern Center have been trying our best to do something about for a long, long time. But this is the sort of thing, again, this doesn't just happen to Mr. McGee. It happens all over the place, where people come into courts, are processed through the courts, and are treated like that. I think the critical things that I would just end with about public defenders, we have to have a structure. For a long time here in Georgia, we had no structure. In Alabama and other places, Texas, very much of New York, a lot of other places, there's no structure, there's no public defender office. So the student who graduates from law school and wants to go out and be a public defender, what, are they going to go to Milledgeville, Georgia and just hang up their shingle? If they do a good job, the local judge won't appoint them to any cases. So that's not going to work in a lot of places. So we have to have public defender offices. In Georgia, we finally, in 2005, 40 years after Gideon versus Wainwright, finally set up a structure. Then, of course, you have to have resources to make that work, to hire the lawyers, the investigators, the paralegals, the administrative staff that you need to run the office. I was just at a meeting, literally, an hour ago, here in Georgia. The governor, new governor, came in January, still 10 months in, has not gotten around to appointing the public defender, which is a gubernatorial appointment. Shouldn't be, but it is. But the public defenders have also been given a 4% decrease in their funding for the rest of this year and a 6% decrease in their funding for next year, which means they have to take furloughs, which is just a nice way of saying you work and don't get paid. And the result of that, needless to say, it's extraordinarily damaging for morale, for people not to be paid when these are probably the hardest working lawyers in the state of Georgia or anywhere else where they're public defenders, and extraordinarily difficult to hire people. And say, well, we'll hire you, but by the way, you're going to be furloughed 6 times in the next year if you take a job here. Independence, the public defender offices, or whatever the method for providing representation, it's got to be independent of the judges. I mean, in Texas, what I've documented over and over, the judges intentionally appoint bad lawyers. If a judge appoints a bad lawyer, you fix that case right from the start. Because if you've got a bad lawyer who's not going to do anything, you are going to be convicted and you are going to be sentenced. And it's just like a wrestling match. It's all determined from the start. And we need, like the federal defenders have, independent boards of directors and independent public defender programs in some states like Missouri, which has an independent public defender commission. They've actually challenged caseloads in the courts. In Georgia, if someone did that, they'd be fired. The importance of having independent public defenders. There's got to be training, there has to be supervision, and there has to be specialization. I'll just end with this letter I got a couple years ago from a woman here in Georgia who had lost everything. Her apartment that she lived in burned up, and the only thing she had left were the clothes on her back. She was studying to be a nurse at the local community college. She was working 2 jobs at Walmart and as a part-time nurse to pay her bills and so forth. She lost both her jobs. And she wrote me this letter, and she said that the lawyer that was appointed to represent her was incompetent. She complained and got another lawyer who constantly encouraged me, and I'm reading her letter here, constantly encouraged me, a person who's never been charged with any crime of any sort, to take 15 years, often offered by the prosecution. A friend offered some money and we hired another lawyer. He misses court dates for weeks at a time. I've been to court so many times that he's not there and told to come back over and over again. I have no place to go. I'm a certified nurse's aide, but I cannot find employment because of the arson charge hanging over me. I don't know how to fix this. And I've asked to be put in jail until this is over. Not because I'm ungrateful for being out on bond, but because I fear I may take my own life or I may die from the condition of being homeless. She says that she's had 20 continuance. I've lost my job, I've lost my home, I've lost my dogs, I sleep in my car, but I can't make the next payment on my car. And my question is, what do I do now? And in a nutshell, she was represented by a public defender office that could put down a guilty plea. That's what they kept encouraging her to do. But had no idea how to try an arson case. No idea how to deal with the science of arson cases. A lot of innocent people get convicted in arson cases. I took her case. I hadn't had an arson case myself in 20 years, but I associated a lawyer, the firm here in Atlanta, who represented insurance companies and was an expert in trying arson cases. And we took the case apart without much trouble with his expertise and with the expert witnesses that he brought to bear on it, and went to the district attorney, laid it all out. Charges were dismissed, and she's gone on with her life. But for a lot of people, there are a lot of people that have those same needs that she has, those desperate needs for some lawyer who will be their advocate, their spokesperson, who will lift them up, who will give them a voice. And so I would say the most critical thing we can do, if nothing else, is to go to offices where we need good lawyers to bring to bear all that they've learned in law school and all that they're learning as they go out into practice, so that people like this young woman don't feel just totally lost in the legal system.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I want to start by thanking ACS for always giving me an opportunity. I was plucked right out of graduating law school, and Megan found me on orders by, I believe, Zanelle. And I've been a part of the ACS family, ever since, and I'm thankful for that. I also want to follow that up by saying this, Steve. I'm not sure if people give you as much credit as you deserve for launching and nurturing lawyers' careers, but you most certainly have. I met Steve in 2015, 2015, I believe. I met him, but it wasn't the first time that I became aware of Steve. I first became aware of Steve while in a super maximum security facility, and I was watching PBS. It was a PBS, and I can't remember if it was an interview of Steve or if they were just talking about the work of the center. And in prison is never quiet. Okay, so if it's quiet, something is horribly wrong or horribly right. And Steve was on, and everyone was quiet, and they were listening to you, and you were talking about the exact same thing that you're talking about today, the representation of poor people, right? And predominantly, that's what our prison system is made up of. I like to say that it most certainly has a prejudicial and racist outcome, but if people were all one color, it would eat up the poor people. That's what it would do. And in 2015, when Steve was speaking at ACS, he mentioned me, and I had just met him like 15 minutes ago. From that, Ari Melber did a feature on me when I was going to clerk for Judge Ann Williams in the Seventh Circuit. And from that, a lot of different trickle-down effects happened, as well as me continuing to be inspired. And that's a difficult thing that I believe that is the reason that a lot of people get poor representation. We deal with burnout from these cases. So I just wanted to just make sure that I acknowledge you and thank you for that. And also, look, I've sent Steve emails, out the blue, and he's responded. And so I thank you for that. It doesn't go unnoticed at all. My story is it's when I think about how far I've come, I think about what I've been through, but I pluck out the most important things for different panels that I speak on and stuff like that. I was born and raised in the city of Chicago. My mother, essentially a single parent, worked a couple crazy jobs. One that required her to drop me off at my grandmother's house at 5 in the morning, just so she could make her way out to O'Hara, where she was working near the airport. And I don't have a story of, I was in the streets and I sold drugs and I gangbanged. Look, I find those stories fascinating when people change their lives around. But that's not my story. I had a solid upbringing. I was, in a rough neighborhood, but I was more afraid of my grandmother than I was of the police. And so when me and my friends, we would get in the car and we would go to different places to go to parties because the neighborhood was just so dangerous, and we weren't gang members or anything like that. So we were really, prey to all factions of the inner city. So we go to a party in Wisconsin, and we sneak and we basically tell each one of our parents we're spending the night over the other one's house, right? So we pull an all-nighter is what we call it, right? That ended at the Waffle House and stuff like that. After going to this party 3 weeks later, there's a card at my door. I am just graduating high school, and I was going to junior college in the fall. Didn't have money to go to a 4-year college right away, and so I get this card at my door, and I answer the card. The card says robbery homicide. So I call the number back, and I'm like, I seen my name, on his card. Like, what is it that what are you looking for me for? So I talked to the detective, and the detective is basically like, yeah, look, your name came up, but you've never been arrested. We just want you to come down here and take a picture so we can clear you from this investigation. I'm 17 at the time, and I said, okay, well, look, You know, my mother doesn't get home till, a few hours. And they're like, he's like, well, how old are you? I said, I'm 17. He asked me on my birthday, and my birthday was coming up in a couple months. He's like, look, man, you don't have to do all that. Just come on down here and take this picture and stuff like that. I go down there, and I am interviewed, right? Essentially what is an interrogation. And I am being accused of a sexual assault that simply was not true, and they knew it wasn't true from the very beginning. To cut the story to the most important part, I can't afford an attorney. My mother doesn't have any money. We're afforded an attorney off of a panel list of attorneys, right? And this is in Jefferson, Wisconsin, not Milwaukee, not Madison. So we get an attorney. I don't know anything about law. I don't know anything about attorneys. I've never been in trouble, never been arrested before. So my only experience with the law was Law and Order. And when Dick Wolf's theme music comes on at the end, you never see the stories that was my life. I was, ultimately wrongfully convicted and sentenced to serve 28 years in prison. And the story was based on just that, an accusation, nothing more. And the attorney that I found out as I was appealing my case and after the Innocence Project got involved, my attorney had graduated law school in 1996. I was on trial in 1998. And he had no insurance, he had no experience, and when he told me and my mother that he was gonna go with a no defense theory, we thought that was a hell of an idea. That's what we thought. We thought it was a great idea. Little did we know he was serving me up for the prison system. I ended up, going to a maximum security prison as a result of how much time that I had gotten. And I started to work on my case after the encouragement of a cellmate. Old white guy, he had been in prison about 18 years, and he started to look at my case. And he just basically, he worked in a law library. So while I was going out playing basketball and playing chess, he would be at work, and I would come in, and I came one day from playing basketball out on the rec yard, and he took off work, and he basically told me, he said, look, man, you're in here for some racist bull crap. I look at tons of guys' cases, and not only are you in here for some bull crap, but you're sitting up here playing chess and playing basketball, and you're acting like you don't even care. And it wasn't that I didn't care. It was that it was my only way to self-medicate myself, so to speak. It was my only release to not think about it. My friends were going off to college, getting cars and sending pictures, and it just reminded me of how much life I was missing. I really did wave the white flag. I started on a case, Strickland versus Washington, that he gave me. And I started to go to the law library, and I started to go from saying, look, I'm innocent, help me get out, to look, I'm innocent. Here are the facts of my case. This is why Strickland versus Washington is analogous to my case. An attorney failed to do his job. Not only did he fail to do his job, but his failures directly impacted the outcome of my case. I eventually was able to get the help of the Wisconsin Innocence Project, and they came and they saw me within days of my habeas relief expiring. A DEPA had been passed, the Anti-Death Penalty and Terrorism Act, had been passed, and it put a timeline on when people could appeal their convictions. And the Innocence Project came and saw me, and I think it was like about 20 days left or something like that. And I was able to get their attention because after the years had passed and I had had that interaction with my cellmate, I started to draft a habeas petition. I was a tutor inside of the law library for people who were getting their HSED, high school equivalency diploma, and I would look in the paper and I would write attorneys. And I wrote an attorney named Rob Hennick out of Milwaukee. And my mother still didn't have any money. We couldn't afford to hire him. But I asked him, would he be willing to edit what I had? And he agreed, and he didn't have to. He was taking, retainers, at what they cost. Really, to do post-conviction work, you're talking about 40, 50, even more when you get done having a client for 3 or 4 years doing an appeal. So he edited my habeas. And I remember the first day when I sent it off, I was so excited. And I knew I wrote me a bad habeas. Man, look, he crossed out everything but my name, right? I was like, look. So he helped me to get this thing together. And I had gotten a habit over the years of mailing ACS, all these organizations, not ACS, but ACLU, wish it was ACS, but ACLU, and I would do a template letter, and I would just change the date. And I told myself, look, either they were going to respond and tell me no, or they were going to say yes, but they were going to respond because I was bombarding everyone with letters every week. And then I finally got the draft done, and I sent it to the Innocence Project. And Keith Finley and the Innocence Project, they came and saw me, and they pretty much kept the argument intact, besides adding an argument that even I wasn't considering. So I was accused of a sexual assault, first degree, where there's a requirement of threat of force and all that type of stuff. And my biggest focal point was like, look, my attorney didn't do a job of finding witnesses, talking to people who can basically undermine the entire allegation. It wasn't until I had a conversation with Keith Finley and he explained to me just exactly what the charges meant in my case. So what happened was, this was a makeout session where this young lady's roommate walked in, and then there was this narrative of rape that was created a month later after, the roommate left and started saying, oh, she's a slut, she's this and all of that. So the testimony was that no one threatened me, no one forced me, and no one did anything like that. So when I was talking to Keith in the Innocence Project, he really did open my eyes to exactly what the criminal justice system is really about. He said, do you realize that if you have testimony of someone saying, no one threatened, no one forced, no one produced a weapon, they are essentially saying the presence of a black man meets the threat of force here. And I just couldn't fathom that, right? But he was right. So we made the argument all the way up to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, and we won on the ineffectiveness. And how we won was this. There was a witness who was pretty much there throughout all of this, right? This was a dorm party. We were upstairs, downstairs, outside, stuff like that. And there was a witness named Sean Demain. And Sean Demain basically was like, look, man, I saw them before, during, after all of that, even after this argument, right? So essentially, we would have had to have been doing a gang rape and then went outside and had a halftime cigarette break and went back up to complete the gang rape. The thing about it is, we did not know about Sean Demain because the investigating officer never turned over his statement to us. So we didn't find that out until after the litigation commenced on post-conviction. And so the Seventh Circuit overturned my conviction, and I'm out 2007. And I remember when my conviction was overturned, a prosecutor filed the motion and basically dismissed all the charges. My record was expunged. And I remember in the courtroom, I don't know what I was expecting, man. Maybe I was expecting the same way that they paraded me around in front of my mother and aunties as a rapist and as a this and as a that. I was expecting the same type of parading of my innocence, and it didn't happen. The judge, in a matter of 5 minutes, accepted the prosecutor's motion, dismissed the charges, and disappeared in the back. And I turned around to the same lady who was in the pew with those wrinkles and creases of anguish on her forehead. And I promised her, I said, look, they didn't acknowledge us today, but I'm gonna make sure that they remember me for the rest of my life. I left out of that courtroom hugging my mother in 2007. I enrolled in junior college a month later. I graduated 2 years later at the top of my class from South Suburban Community College. I enrolled in Roosevelt four-year college to complete my bachelor's degree. And I was working as an investigator full-time at the Federal Public Defender's Office, where I testified in the courtroom and where I started to get involved with Just the Beginning Foundation and Judge Ann Claire Williams. And I eventually went on to win a Chicago Bar Foundation scholarship and was able to go to Loyola, graduated from there, and I started a clerkship in Judge Williams' chambers. And let me tell you something. You never know when you're going to meet someone who can help you become someone to help someone else. I met Judge Williams, and I met her through applying for the Chicago Bar Foundation scholarship. I had been through the hallways and testifying and got a chance to see her, but she didn't know my story until I applied for the scholarship. She immediately sent the note over to my job and said, tell him to come over. So as an investigator, I'm going out in the field, I'm serving subpoenas, interviewing witnesses and stuff like that. So I come in one day, And the lady at the front desk where I work was like, hey, you got a note, the judge wants to see you. I paused because the last time I responded to a note, I ended up with 28 years in prison, right? So I went and, the judge was like, look, I, am a part of the committee who selects who wins this scholarship. And because your last name is Adams and it starts with A, I read yours first. And I told, everyone else, I'm like, look, unless you can find me another story like this, I don't really need to read the rest of them, right? And it was that relationship that got me as comfortable as I am now presenting and talking to folks. Judge Williams had me in front of groups as small as 4 or 5, talking to kids and then telling my story. And now it's gotten me to the point where I confidently stand up in court and able to present. I was just telling Steve, I flew in from Boston doing an evidentiary hearing, and when it came to its conclusion, the judge was like, you present very well, Mr. Adams. Now, I took that as a compliment, but I was almost saying to myself, man, what did you think I was going to get up and start rapping or something like that? Like, man, what's going on here? So after doing the clerkship with Judge Williams set me up. I was on the lady end because of this wrongful conviction in a lot of things, right? I'm one of the oldest that was in my law school at the time, and I didn't apply for the clerkship how it naturally is done. I basically went to Judge Williams and was like, look, if I can come up with the money, would you put me in chambers and help me do this? And she did. She created what was called a dual fellowship. I did the 6 months in the Seventh Circuit, and I did the remainder of the year in the Southern District of New York with Judge Deborah Batts, who's another amazing judge. And it is what I learned in those chambers that has continued to help me along, through life, through my early legal career. I started with the Innocence Project in 2016 after finishing up with the fellowship. And the Innocence Project is set up where attorneys are assigned different states. It's a national organization that does innocence, and I really just wanted to find a way to put a bow on my story. These people helped me, even though they were the Wisconsin Innocence Project. The Innocence Project in New York was what started the springboard for a lot of these organizations. And I just really felt compelled to just, in my own way, be able to give back. And so when I got there, they assigned me to a couple of different attorneys, and they gave me well, what do you want to do? So you know what state I picked, right? I picked Wisconsin. You know I did. So I had the opportunity to work with an amazing attorney there, Bryce Benjack, who was a staff attorney, there during my tenure there. And we were a part of the overturning of a conviction where a guy, amazingly enough, I was working in the law library, as I told you guys, and I was helping people, and this guy came up to me, Richard Baranek, and was asking me to help his case, and I couldn't get to it. And 10 years to the date of me being released from prison, I'm in Wisconsin court doing an evidentiary hearing where it was ultimately ruled in our favor, where they overturned his conviction and he was released. After that, they did a Lester Holt segment, and I left the Innocence Project and I started my own firm. And basically what I do is exactly what I wasn't able to get. My mother is, she's something else. She's amazing. So I give her my diploma when it comes in the mail, and so she starts to cry. And I'm like, what, we done crying? What you crying? What's going on? She's like, no, I'm not crying because I'm sad. I'm crying because I know you're not just going to go off and practice law to become rich. You're going to do this because you're going to remember what we went through, and there's going to be some other single mother who can't afford an attorney. So, in her way, she was telling me what I was going to do. Not, you know what I mean? Like not asking me, right? So, I've been inspired to continue to do that. We don't get rich with the work that me and Steve we do, but you can't put a price tag on what it pays for the soul. What I realize is this. I'm here not because of a magic trick. I'm here because I still had a family structure to come home to. My mother and my aunts made sure that I got in therapy almost immediately, right? And that's something that we don't talk about a lot in these communities that are affected by the criminal justice system. We don't have post-traumatic stress there. We have persistent traumatic stress, because post means it ended. Nothing ends. People who go to prison and get out they go right back to the communities that they were arrested in more often than not. And these communities are the real victims. They're the real victims. I'm opening up the office in Chicago because, you know, in New York, you know, you go around, you introduce yourself, I'm from Chicago, and I don't think it's funny that everyone equates Chicago with gun violence. You know, I don't. You know, I don't think it's funny. So I want to go back and I want to help, and I want to prove a point that there's not one gun manufacturer in the state of Illinois. Not one. Yet, it's swamped with guns. And these guns aren't in the affluent neighborhoods. These guns are on the south side, on the west side. And essentially, if you can look at me and say, this is amazing, this guy's talented, I'm glad he's practicing law. Well, think about how many other kids we're blowing out the candle on before they even get a chance to be lit. I'm here because of opportunity. I'm here because of people that I met, because of networking, getting the opportunity to be involved with ACS, meeting Steve, and people have extended their palms to me and helped, and I'm doing the same thing. The thing about the criminal justice system is this. We've always put a Band-Aid on things, right? It's not just public defenders that we need. They need the resources. Because if not, they're just standing up there. I mean, that's it. You look at this, I do a lot of post-conviction work. I get the opportunity to read a lot of records. I've seen sentencing hearings that last 30 minutes. How can you explain a person's life in a mitigating, persuasive way in 30 minutes? And so we have decided through, this thing didn't just start now. This has been historical. Predominantly, you have people of color who are in prison. And so why is it so easy for us not to tackle this issue? It's because we've been fed a narrative historically that people of color, especially men, are aggressive, oh, they did it. That's been the narrative and that's been a depiction of black men. And so when you look at a system that has predominantly black men incarcerated, it's not an easy issue to tackle because historically we've been fed to believe that this is, you know, this is what it is, right? And we have a job to do collectively. If we want to continue as a society moving forward, you know, we have to go in and we can't just change the bucket of water. We have to tear up the floor and get to the pipes. That's what we have to do. So now I'm an attorney. I could talk all day long, so I'm going to stop now, okay? All right? Thank you.
So y'all, I have to say that I think I might be completely irrelevant here because the two of them could talk all day and have a lot more to say. But I wanted to, the first question I wanted to ask was about what we're seeing right now in the field of criminal justice change, and especially one of the things that my organization focuses on, which is prosecutors. So you see a lot of talk right now about progressive prosecutors, fixing prosecutors, getting better prosecutors in there, but we know that that's not actually going to address the whole problem, right? In terms of indigent defense, where do you think that there needs to be more national focus? I think that's both on an organizing level, but also on a media level, right? On sort of an academic level. Where do you think that there should be, where the focus should be when it comes to how to address the indigent defense problem that we have?
Well, Robert Kennedy said when he was the Attorney General, the poor person accused of a crime has no lobby. And that's the great, great problem that we have. Why would a government that's trying to convict people and kill them or imprison them or fine them give them a lawyer who would frustrate that purpose? That's a catch-22 we've never been able to get around. Why would Georgia provide for good lawyers to represent people when Georgia wants to put everybody in prison or send them to death row? And so if the effort is going to be made, it has to be raised up to where people, the responsible people, leaders of the bar, leaders in the legislature, leaders in the judiciary, other people come forward. Georgia, we didn't have that for 40 years, and we were just in a totally embarrassing legal system. One day in Gainesville, on the third day of trial, it turns out the guy sitting at counsel table is not the defendant in that case. The lawyer didn't realize the guy sitting next to him, they brought him to the jail, was not the right client. They were 3 days into trial. We found a guy that has been 13 months in jail in Cordele, charged with loitering. And actually, the charges had been dismissed 5 months earlier, but nobody bothered to call the jail to tell them that there's no basis for holding this guy. You can't hold him anymore. There's no charges against him. And so our intern got him out. That's how bad it was. Finally, we had 3 Chief Justices in a row who raised the claim and would go before Chief Justice Clark, who told the legislature, we've set our sights on the embarrassing target of mediocrity. And mediocrity is about halfway. And halfway justice is halfway injustice, and that's no justice at all. Very summed it all up. He was extremely generous because Georgia had never even set its sights on the target of mediocrity. It had just aimed as low as you could get, I think. But that Blue Ribbon Commission being appointed, the bar finally, after all these years, coming around, and then a lot of lawsuits that we filed. We just started going and I said, coming soon to a courthouse near you, suing judges and county commissions because they were not providing lawyers to the people accused of crimes, that the meet 'em and plead 'em system that they had was violating the right to counsel. But it took an awful lot. I think we brought 6 of those lawsuits in different parts of Georgia that ultimately led to the passage of the Indigent Defense Act in 2003. And that's what has to be done in virtually every state and every place. And what's really too bad is that in so many places there is no leadership. But we just have to do it ourselves. We decided about mid-90s that things were so bad here that we were just going to start raising hell about it and start filing lawsuits. And if nothing happened, well, at least we wouldn't be any worse off, but maybe something good would come out of it. And certainly wasn't the only thing, but it certainly contributed to ultimately realizing a problem that even Sonny Perdue, now our agriculture commissioner, or agriculture secretary, but at that time governor, even Sonny Perdue acknowledged that the system was so bad something had to be done about it. And so the legislature passed a statewide indigent defense. But that's just the first step. Then getting it funded, still not funded. Now they're cutting the funding and having it staffed and all those things. But we're making progress, and I think that's what has to be done. And I think one of the things that some of the progressive prosecutors have been good about is realizing that it is an adversary system. If it's going to be an adversary system, which is what we're supposed to have, whether that's a good idea or not, it's way over my head. But if we're going to have it, then there has to be competent lawyers, resources, all of those things available to people who are poor people who are accused of crimes.
Yeah, I think, so there's a lot. Whenever you have an issue like this that's huge, there's a lot of things that need to be done. One of the first things that need to happen is prosecutors shouldn't have immunity. There's absolutely no reason why a prosecutor should have immunity for the actions in which they do. They're in charge of lives, right? So why would they ever be immune from doing something wrong? Look, our system, like Steve said, is an adversarial system. I don't agree with it. I really do think that it creates a problem, because if you have a spoon clapping contest, people's competitive juices are going to flow, and they're going to want to do what? Win, right? How many people who have been former prosecutors who are running for judge in states where they elect, how many prosecutors have you ever heard say, elect me, because if we got the wrong guy, I won't prosecute him? Have you ever heard them say that? No. They say, elect me. I've got a 99.9% conviction rate. So that's really the problem. And also the resources. Our Department of Justice assigns billions to criminal justice, right? And on this pie chart, well over 70, 80% is geared towards what they deem as criminal justice. Mm-hmm. That means lock them up, okay? And it's like 1% mental health care, 2% reentry. Well, if you put more into locking people up, you're going to lock people up. We had a war on drugs that put a noose on the neck of the black community, and we're still dealing with it right now. You want to know why? You got kids running around with these big guns and no structure, because that structure was broken by the crack era. That's what it was. I was born in the 80s. From my front porch, I saw the crack come into our communities and destroy it. And when my friends' mothers and fathers were being affected by the crack, they would go with grandma. And grandma was usually strong. She usually came from Jackson or Cleveland, Mississippi, and she ruled with an iron duke like my grandmother. Well, fast forward now. Who are the grandmothers, right? Who are the grandfathers? They are the ones who are affected by the crack in the community, right? So you talk about reparations. Why do we need reparations? Are you serious? Really? Right? These communities were destroyed. And if we treated the crack epidemic the same way we treated the opioid epidemic, then we would have a lot different in our communities, right? So I say this: prosecutors shouldn't have immunity, and make it equal. The resources should be equally applied to both the indigent as well as a prosecutor. When an indigent person gets a public defender, he might have an investigator that puts in a few hours, right? When a prosecutor brings a case, he has what is at his disposal? You know, the local police department, sheriffs, investigators, maybe the feds if they want to call in. The scale isn't fair, and so we don't have equality.
Part of the problem, too, is when people actually get counsel, right? In so many places, especially for misdemeanor charges, people are not actually having any access to counsel at all anyway. Even, I think in Georgia, it had been law for a couple decades before they actually, in Georgia it had been law for a couple decades before they actually implemented that as part of the rule. But there's this kind of balance, right? This sort of tension between the need for more resources and the need for more lawyers at earlier points. And I think I started my career at the Bronx Defenders, and then I went and saw a public defender in Augusta, and it was a very different experience for me. Can you both talk a little bit about the rural-city divide, especially what you're seeing even further out, which you talked a little bit about, Steve, but in your personal case, your own sort of situation, and how we address the inequity of public defense, not only between public defense and prosecution, but between big cities and small towns, especially since small towns are driving a lot of the jail population right now. They're driving a lot of mass incarceration.
It's like a tree falling in the woods. I mean, in these small towns. I have a case right now in Waverly, Virginia right now, where two guys were falsely accused and convicted of a death of an officer. And, they pled guilty to one accessory after the fact, another one manslaughter. I want you to just think about that for a second. Who on earth ever gets a deal like that for the death of the police officer? That right there alone should show you just how it's nonsense, right? But they did it because they're down in this town. What I realized in going down to Waverly so much is this: some of these towns are 60, 50 years back, even more at times. They don't have a voice. Thankfully now with social media, we are allowing everyone is getting the opportunity to be their own news segment. But there's a lot of attention that needs to be paid, because you're right. A lot of these small towns are driving mass incarceration with drug offenses and with the revolving door of getting one case, you get on parole, and it's basically putting your life on layaway when you keep going in and out the system. So I think that overall, what we have to do is what Steve talked about. Look, we got to sue the bejesus out of people. I mean, that's really what we have to do. Sometimes, there are two types of courts that I like to say. There's the court in legal, then there's the court of public appeal that gets things done as well. And so we have to continue to be litigious in our efforts. The thing is, it's hard to get people to do this type of work because the resources aren't there. So that's why we have to continue to draw on our donor bases and also hold people accountable who are running for office and giving us promises. We have to hold them accountable. And if they don't do it, and if they don't divert the resources to where they are desperately needed, we need to find someone else. So.
And it also goes back to my point earlier about how do you enforce the right to counsel. If there's no lawyer for people, and there are courts that operate, there are municipal courts right here in Atlanta was doing it, and a lot of municipal courts around the state are doing it. They don't have lawyers at all. People come in there, they can be locked up, they are locked up from time to time. There's nobody to assert the right to counsel, there's nobody to call the judge on it. So they get away with it. I remember when I would go around the state on my death penalty cases, and I would be in a courtroom waiting for my case to be called, and they'd be calling people up in felony cases, and the judge would say, talk to that man over there, and he'd be telling the defendant to talk to the prosecutor. And they would talk to the prosecutor for a few minutes, and the prosecutor would say, this is going to be a plea. and they'd put down a guilty plea. And I was like, wait a minute, there's no lawyer here. That was just the prosecutor and the defendant entered a felony plea, and the judge took it and put it down, and nobody's raising any hell. One of the things we started doing years ago was sending people to court. Go watch and see what's happening in these courts. And we took our summer students and sent them out to all courtrooms all across the state. Go watch the number of constitutional violations you see going on in these courts, in municipal courts, misdemeanor courts, other courts. If you read the case of Argersinger versus Hamlin, where the Supreme Court held there's a right to a lawyer anytime your liberty is at stake. And you read that opinion where it talks about these misdemeanor courts where everything is speed, it's like assembly line, it's all totally impersonal. It's a perfect description of how those courts work today, 40 years after Argersinger was decided. There's still courts where most of the people in the courts don't have lawyers at all. And if you're a person accused, there is no such thing as a small case. There is no such thing as a small case, a small loss of your liberty or your money. People absolutely have to be advised by lawyers and be represented by lawyers. And one way, I think, to change it is just to put the light of day on it. I think that's very important. Every law school, if you're not doing it, law professors should be sending their students out to see what's happening in the courts because it will not match up to what you're teaching. I guarantee you, it will not match up in terms of what's going on and the way people are being treated in the courts, and that's the first step to doing something about it.
Can you talk a little bit about the Indigent Defense Act of in 2003? So you started talking about it and you gave a little bit of background and said, but now it also needs to be funded. But it was a very groundbreaking sort of moment in the fight for quality indigent defense, and giving some context of what it's done in Georgia and also where it has and hasn't been replicated elsewhere. I would love to hear it.
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things about it. One, it illustrates what a difference the right to counsel makes. I'll come to that in a minute. But we went from 159, I think it is, counties in Georgia, and every county, up to every county, how to run its indigent defense system. And some counties have three courts. They have a felony court, a misdemeanor court, and a juvenile court. And so there might be one system of providing lawyers in felony court, another in misdemeanor, and yet another in juvenile court. And what a lot of the counties, there are only 20 public defender offices in the state of Georgia when the Indigent Defense Act was passed, out of 159 counties. And what many of the counties did was contract with the lowest bidder to do all the cases. Maybe one lawyer in McDuffie County, one lawyer did all the cases for a flat rate. You can imagine how much time he spent on those indigent cases. He could also handle private practice. He's going to get paid $10,000 for doing all the poor cases, no matter how much or how little time he spends, so he's going to spend as little time on that as possible, and the rest of his time on his paying cases, his divorces and title searches and things like that. Or in some places, they would contract with 3 or 4. Dothan, Alabama, one lawyer for each judge. And as one lawyer down there told me, he said one judge got very concerned about a spate of acquittals, and so he replaced the lawyer that was in front of him with someone else who would not be quite so vigorous in representing the clients. Where we really, and what we now have in Georgia is a system by judicial districts, not by counties, that each judicial district, which may have 4 or 5 counties, has a public defender office with lawyers who are devoted to representing people. We also have some conflict defender offices that represent people in conflict cases, because very often in criminal cases, several people are charged, and the same lawyers can't represent all the defendants. They can only represent one. So we have that. Some of these offices are horrible. Cordele, I applied actually to be the public defender in Cordele. They turned me down, but I said I want to try to take the worst office in the state and turn it into the best, but they weren't interested in doing that. But it's a meet 'em and plead 'em. And then other places we have actually very good public defenders, very dedicated, people who are really doing a great job for their clients and always pushing the envelope to get more resources, more of what they need. But let me tell you what a difference lawyers make. At one time in this state, in Virginia, death penalty cases were handled by any lawyer that had a bar card. Anybody that had a heartbeat and a bar card. And some of them, that's about all they had. I mean, Robert Hulsey represented by a lawyer who drank a quart of vodka every day during his trial. If you don't understand what a quart of vodka is, that's 21 shots. 21 shots of vodka every day during this trial, upheld by the Georgia Supreme Court, the 11th Circuit, and Hulsey's executed. Since 2005, we've had a capital defender office. In the last 5 years, we did not have a single death sentence imposed in Georgia. At a different time, a ways back, we went 2 years without a single death penalty being imposed. If you go to Virginia, which is second only to Texas in the number of executions of a state, 113 since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Virginia, second to Texas, 113, now has 4 regional capital defender offices. There has not been a death sentence in Virginia since 2011. There are 3 people on death row in Virginia today because of the public defenders. And here in Georgia, I saw the capital defender this morning, we have 6 capital defender offices. And instead of having the drunks and the guys that couldn't get any other business and were just taking these cases for a payday, people are now represented by lawyers that know what they're doing, and lawyers that are totally dedicated to their clients, and lawyers that have mitigation specialists and paralegals and investigators and the access to expert witnesses, all the things that we never had before. And it has really made a difference. The only death sentence, tragically, was earlier this year when a young woman fired her lawyers, brain-damaged woman, went to trial without putting up any defense whatsoever, and was sentenced to death, which is a really sad and tragic thing in many, many ways. But in the cases where capital defenders have been engaged, it's just the difference between day and night in terms of having competent lawyers and having people with a bar card.
Yeah, you know, it's the problems. A lot of the problems that we have with the criminal justice system is we've had them since its inception, right? So when you think about the problem of the poor and how they're treated, I can guarantee you poor people weren't at the table when we were constructing the criminal justice system, right? Because I'm sure they wouldn't have advocated for, all right, well, let's have a monetary bail system, right? Well, you can put up money so I can get out and defend myself if I'm innocent. I'm sure they didn't vote for that, right? And also with the process of having adequate counsel as well, right? Poor people weren't sitting there when they said, all right, Liz, just buy a lawyer, right? That wasn't decided. And so I think that we really do need to get to the pipes of this thing. I think if you want to stop mass incarceration, and you want to stop this glutton for punishment, you got to start in the communities. That's where you have to start at. The communities are basically they're a conduit for what's going on in our criminal justice system. And I think that more than just people having the opportunity to go visit the courtrooms, they should stay in these communities for a little while and see exactly what goes on there. See how the police different sectors, but then they occupy others, right? And it's because of what is there. The resources are something that we desperately need, and that's why I think that we have to stop asking now. We have to start suing. We have to start demanding it on people. And not just letting it be a slogan. Right now, criminal justice reform is something that's sexy, so to speak, right? Everybody's talking about it, but no one's really tackling the real issue of it, which is reentry. Over 50% of the people who are incarcerated have been incarcerated at some point. So what does that mean? What that means is this. I'll use this analogy that I like to use. Think about it if it was a car company. So think about if one of these major car companies produced cars off of a line, and within 2 to 3 years they came back because the engines were blowing up or something was going horribly wrong. There would be a debate on Senate somewhere, right, to shut down this company. There will be some national coverage to do something about this company. So why aren't we having that same national discussion to really do it in terms of the criminal justice system? And it's because the people who are affected have very, very, very small voices, if any, right? It shouldn't take Kim Kardashian or another celebrity to get people out who don't deserve to be in prison. We have a whole section of people who, if you don't think a person has served enough time after 20 years for a non-fatal violent offense, you tell me why them spending another decade in there would make them safe for society. It doesn't. It doesn't make sense. We have people at the top who are making the decisions for the communities who are not from and don't really understand these communities. And I keep, when I answer questions, I definitely want to answer exactly what you're asking, but I also want to point out to what the real problem is. And the real problem is the resources and what we in society deem as important. Why do police officers, teachers, people like that get paid less? But if you are a broker, you get paid more than anyone, right? It just makes no sense at all. So in society, we each collectively need to beat the same drum about what's going on in our community. It shouldn't spill over into downtown and make us have a reaction to it. We should care just because it's happening in Gwinnett or anywhere else in these counties. And so I think that the resources are a major thing that we need to find a way to get inside of these communities and these public defender systems. These public defenders are just simply swamped. They just are. You can't expect someone to do an amazing job with so little time, right? And I think we know that. And so we have to figure out some way to be litigious and litigate this issue on behalf of a class, right? A certain class. And that class is the communities who are underserved.
So I'm going to open it up for questions. I have 11 more questions on my list, so if nobody has any, I have more to go. But I want to open it up. If anybody has one. Two over here.
I have a really scary question. I apologize for being so scary. Justice Thomas, this term, I believe, wrote a dissenting opinion suggesting that Gideon should be reversed, saying that Americans do not have a right to counsel. They have a right to it, they can pay for it, but if they don't pay for it, they don't have a right. So far, that's just Justice Thomas. Are we concerned this disease, infection, is spread throughout the world?
As I say so often, when somebody asks me, like after Flowers versus Mississippi and that case and others, to explain that, I say, Justice Thomas is off in his own little constitutional world, which, thank God, nobody else is in. And, you know, at one time, Justice Rehnquist, of all people, said of all the cases ever decided by the Supreme Court, the one that universally was admired and agreed to was Gideon versus Wainwright, the 1963 case that said you had a right to a lawyer. Read, if you haven't read Tony Lewis's great book, Gideon's Trumpet, it's very short, quick read, but it's great promise, but the problem is it's an unfunded mandate. I don't think we're ever going to go. I think even who concurred, either Alito or Gorsuch, didn't join that part of the opinion. So Thomas, as he so often is pretty much out there all by himself, and let's hope he stays there.
I'll say this. I'm sure he would have a different opinion if he wasn't able to afford to defend himself when he was accused, right? I'm sure his opinion would be a whole lot different.
I'm curious if you had your way or in a perfect world, what would it take and what would you do to take criminal justice reform out of this area of being super sexy and interesting to folks, but not necessarily the most effective? What do you think it's going to take, or what would you do to start actually making change happen and action happen?
Well, I think this. I mean, I think a lot of the things that have caused change to be in the wind have been good. You know, Learned Hand, the great judge, once said, you know, the nightmare of an innocent person being convicted, it just never really happens. That just doesn't happen. He was a great judge. But we now know from DNA and cell phones that he was absolutely wrong about that, that a lot of innocent people have been convicted and have been sent away for a long time. And like with Michael Morton's case, where he served 25 years in Texas, the actual culprit went out and raped and killed another person, whereas they'd gotten on him to begin with, that wouldn't have happened. And I think, you know, that sort of accuracy and reliability concern has spurred some of this. I think what's really spurred what we've seen here in Georgia, which has actually been, you know, take it or leave it, I'd take it, it's been cost. We just can't keep building a prison and locking people up 24/7. We were just building prison after prison after prison after prison. At some point, you spend $1.5 billion on that. You just can't do it anymore. So let's have accountability courts. Let's try to divert people. Let's try to deal with drug problems in the community instead of in prison. I appreciate any attention that there is to it, but I think that if you look at John Pfaff's book, Locked Up, and he talks about sentencing and prosecutors rolling, but he says all through there, If only there was an indigent defense system. If only the prosecution was held to account by defense lawyers, but that's not the case all over the place. And you see other people point that out. So one fundamental part of it has to be to have lawyers for poor people accused of crimes. Unfortunately, it's an expensive proposition. Lawyers are expensive. And again, there's not a great constituency for it. So I think it's always going to be a struggle. That's why lawsuits are so important. Is one way to increase your leverage is to file lawsuits. And if you have an independent organization like Southern Center for Human Rights here, or like Arch City Defenders in St. Louis, or whoever it may be, those people can bring lawsuits. The public defenders here can't bring a lawsuit saying my caseload is overwhelming. They'll lose their job the next day. I can sue them, though, and say they can't do their job because their caseload is overwhelming, and we can, get more resources out of that and maybe bring some change about. But I will tell you this, it is no panacea. It is an incredible struggle. These lawsuits are very unwieldy. They're very difficult. They're just really expensive. They're expensive. And I have, we brought 6 before the system got started, and then after it got started, we had some real problems, and so we filed several more afterwards and litigated them, and it did bring about some change, but it's by the hardest, but I think that's what you have to do. That's what you have to do.
I don't, look, this might not ever be possible, but what I believe, if anyone gets a job, there's always, a probationary period, right? I believe we should have a probationary period on the presidency, because all these people talking about what they're going to do with criminal justice reform and stuff like that, if they don't do it, we should be able to get them out of there in 60 to 90 days. Is that the probationary period? Because that's really what it's going to take. I mean, all of our problems, start at the top. I mean, and they trickle their way down. I just, I can't, state enough how much of what we're missing out on. You know what I mean? Like, people are born into things that they have no control over, right? And I think that we are losing out on a lot of talent. Who knows? One of these people who I was incarcerated with probably had a patent for a drug that can help cure cancer or whatever it is. We don't know what we're throwing away. And I just really believe that is what we need to do. And I am just starting, but I am putting together the legs of a civil suit. And it's in the works. It's going to be a while. Because it's going to take resources and people to agree with what I'm saying, and basically I am trying to hopefully sue people who are responsible for our communities. We vote people into offices, in the different offices in our communities, and they are just continuing to be in deplorable conditions. Those people should be held accountable. If I'm responsible for someone, let's say an elder person, and I neglect those responsibilities, I can be brought on charges of neglect. So why can't we bring these constituents on charges of neglect? Why? Why can't we, right? So it's just something to think of, because we have to stop asking. We have to stop asking, and we have to start demanding the rights of these communities, which will affect us all. They simply will.
Lawyers are expensive, and it's one of the reasons that the indigent system is so difficult to fund. Lawyers are expensive, I think, because law school is expensive. So what do you think is the role of law school in educating, training, and making it affordable for people to become public defenders?
Well, that's an easy one to knock out of the ballpark by saying we shouldn't have tuition for law school. I'm all for that. But the likelihood that's going to happen, I'm not sure how great, although at Georgetown, where I'm teaching right now, I just learned this the other day. There's 6 students there who got a complete free ride, just like the Ruth Tilden program at NYU. So, but that's only 6. One of the things I think is good about loan forgiveness, which they have at Yale, and many of the people I've hired have been out of Yale and Harvard and other places that have loan forgiveness, is that way at least you know that people are actually doing the work and are getting loan forgiveness. The other thing I would just say on this area, Georgetown also has the Prettyman program, which is a sort of postgraduate program on how to, a 2-year program on a master's degree on representing poor people accused of crimes or teaching in clinics. I don't understand why other law schools don't have that and don't have this opportunity for students who really want to go and be public defenders, but have, as all my students tell me, I want to go somewhere where I'm going to be trained so I know what I'm doing. I want to be supervised, because if I'm going to be a good conscientious lawyer for my clients, I need to know what I'm doing. And if I go out to Tupelo, Mississippi, that may not be the case. So what do? Of course, part of the answer to that's Gideon's Promise, John Rapping's program, which does provide some training and then sends people to Greenville and Memphis and New Orleans and a lot of other public defender offices. But I think law schools need to be doing more of that. Unfortunately, the program at Georgetown seems to be shrinking rather than growing, which I think is really too bad, because the law schools really need to be on the cutting edge here. In terms of making it possible for people to go and paying their loans if they go, but also giving them training to go and be public defenders. So I think there's a lot that law schools could do to help the problem here.
I agree with Steve, and I also will say this. We can't ask people to do stuff that we're not doing, and that means lawyers as well. Lawyers who are these big firms, all of these big firms need to collectively push people through law school, pay for loans, take care of loans. And I'm not talking about the guy that you golf with, daughter, and all that type of stuff. I'm talking about people in these areas need to be pushed through, nurtured, and trained. Like, training is important for attorneys. And I think that we owe a responsibility and a duty to the profession to make sure that we have more people who are responsible and trained inside of our professions. And, you know, you can name the laundry list of big firms that need to step up to the plate and do more than just name a head for pro bono, right? And it seems like to me, the pro bono person is always a person of color, right? In these big firms. So I think that we need to do more than just look like we're doing stuff and actually do it. This is one of the things that I advocate for. We need to have the communities at the microphone telling their stories. I can tell you about a case. A lot of times people like to hear me talk because I'm telling you about the case that I had before. We need to create more stories and have people up telling their stories about how it's affecting them. I've realized that through humanizing people, you politely indict them to do the right thing. So I think having more people tell their stories, I think a part of litigating, a huge part of litigating is mitigating. And I think that the way you mitigate is by telling the stories of the people who are directly affected by it. I think also this, right now, technology is advanced to the point where everyone can be in contact with almost anyone. I think that since there is a group of attorneys here, there are people who are watching, I think that we all need to do an email chain and start putting the legs together on tackling one issue at a time, whether it be bond and bail across the board. I think that there are all types of lawyer emails that I don't even know how I got a part of, that I'm a part of, right? But these groups, I think that we collectively can make this thing easier by taking one issue at a time and devoting whatever minutes and seconds that we have to the research and to the complaint that can be filed, and try to set precedent that will have sweeping changes. So that may not have answered the three things, but the one thing can affect many things. And I think that that's what we need to do. We need to find a way to work together better. Far gone are the days where it's like, you're in Georgia and I don't know what you're doing because I'm in New York, right? Now we have email, we have Google this and Google that and Snapface and all that good stuff, right? So I think that we need to find a way to all globally work together. There are many public defenders, there are many people who are preaching the same thing that me and Steve are talking about. But I think now we need to find a way to put our legs on the ground and do something about it. And maybe we start in a small county that we can hopefully set precedent to. I mean, look, think about what RBG did, right? When arguing, for equality of women. She took a case that, that thing was not immediately analogous, right? But she made it, and she set precedent. And so we need that great mind. And I don't know if I'm it, maybe I can spark that great mind. But I know that we all need to work together to find a way to start litigating the issues in our communities.
Well, I'll just offer a couple. One, be a public defender. People who are inclined to do this. A lot of these offices are only going to be better if good people go and make them better. And that's what has to be done. Now, I will agree, there's some offices that are so horrible and do such absolute malpractice day in and day out that one would not want to go there. But there are others like the New Orleans Public Defender, Memphis, and other places where they're struggling, but they can be better. And if good people are there, representing their clients, lifting them up, working on their cases, doing everything they could, that's going to bring that up. I've seen people go, students of mine go to offices that weren't that good, and I've seen them lift those offices up to all of a sudden they're investigating cases and they're doing things that hadn't been done there before, and it's contagious, and other people do it. Second thing I would say, no matter what one does, everybody who's a lawyer or part of the legal system needs to be responsible for what happens in the criminal courts, to what happens to poor people accused of crimes, because it suffers when it's out of sight and out of mind. And that's the great problem we have, is it's out of sight and out of mind. It's poor people being processed through this system very fast with very short shrift, very little attention to people as individuals, and people have to pay. The bar, the Georgia bar wants to be worried about everything in the world except what happens to poor people in the criminal courts. They just don't want to go there except kicking and screaming. But that's what the leaders of the bar should be doing. And that's what organizations like ACS has to be holding people's feet to the fire and saying, we absolutely have to do something about this on a systemic policy basis. That was two. I'll give you two and let go of that.
Okay.
Right, sure.
Okay, we have, I think, time for hopefully at least one more question, maybe two. I'm looking, yes, I'll go in the middle. Since all three of you want to go, I'm going to go right in the middle, yeah. Oh, you're pointing at her. Okay, go ahead.
I'm from Texas, and one of the things that struck me when I was working there were the ways in which the federal judicial system itself was biased against pro se prisoners and capital defendants, specifically by having special pro se law clerks where people stay in that role for 15 years and get burnt out or certainly are what they see, to having death clerks or death penalty law clerks who used to be in prosecutors' offices. And I'm wondering, short of, aside from getting different people in those roles, what can be done to combat that? But sort of to help people work through that system and to change the system. And you mentioned law libraries. Are things like, distributing pro se prisoner litigant manuals, is that helpful? What should be the focus there?
I think that everyone, that's a great question too, but I think that everyone has a responsibility to do one pro bono case, like seriously. And I'm not talking about the pro bono case that you want to do. I'm talking about the one that is difficult to do. And I think that will have a huge effect. I really do. And I think that most certainly communications inside of if you can get them inside of prisons and stuff like that would be helpful. But there's a need for more effective representation. And so I think that we have to both put people in the world of being an attorney, being an effective attorney, a trained attorney, but then we also have to call on those who are making, big bucks. I mean, I really think Rudy Giuliani's time would be well spent mentoring some kids through law school as opposed to these interviews he's been doing, right? So I think that that's really what we need to do. We need to continue. I mean, look, I never know how effective, me speaking on panels and stuff like that. I just know that I want to continue to tell my story. But I'm hoping that someone sees this and they turn around and they do take that one case. They answer that one letter. I mean, just the fact that Steve is bringing a letter here lets me know that I'm continuing on the right track, because I get letters and emails and stuff like that, and it just reminds me of my mother. And I respond. Even if I can't help, I give them a list of people who they should reach out to and tell them to continue to fight. I do a number of pro bono cases. So that's what I advocate for. I mean, attorneys, whether practicing or not, you just don't know who you can help with giving a second of your time to.
With regard to the death clerks and so forth, that was the first panel this morning about becoming a judge or people becoming judges. Unfortunately, you know, there was a time, it's probably most people alive today don't know about it or remember it, but there was a book actually written called Unlikely Heroes about the judges on the Fifth Circuit when Brown versus Board of Education was decided and they were responsible for implementing it in the South. Now we don't have the heroes, we just have the unlikely. And most of the judges we have, unfortunately, there and here are sort of like the soldiers who come on the battlefield after the battle and shoot the wounded. And I think as long as those people are running the courts, we're going to have these people. I've called out Edith Jones every chance I get, but, you know, it's life tenure. They have those clerks, like you say. But you have to hope that there are going to be some judges and some people that are going to rebel against that. But that just shows what short shrift the judges, they don't want to bother, they're too high and mighty to deal with prisoners and pro se cases and all that, instead of realizing how incredibly important they are, like, you know, some of the Judge Frank Johnson and Elbert Tuttle and people like that did back in the old days. There are judges on the courts that I think still see how important that is and see how important it is to try to recruit pro bono lawyers and so forth, but you'd be surprised, there's a lot of institutional fighting of that too. I mean, depriving people of lawyers is a great way to fix the system, and it includes people who have good pro se cases and who are denied pro bono counsel. Yeah. When any court appeals judge, federal court appeals judge can call a law firm and say, I want you to take this case pro bono. They're going to do it. I mean, they have to do it.
Right.
But whether they make the call is the question.
So one thing I wonder is how much, you talked a lot about local communities and rural communities and starting there, and I wonder how much of the problem is also cultural in that when I think about, I'm from Florida, and when I think about Polk County, some of the rural counties, you're talking about 60, 70 years ago, the criminal justice systems there were formed around an era of lynching, people being accused of a crime and expected not to complain, not to say anything, just go through it, or something's going to happen to you. And so that's not that long ago. And so I just wonder culturally and how things work in these areas. You know, your dad's a judge, you become the town lawyer. And you know, your granddad would have been a judge in that era, for example. So it's not that long ago. So how much do you think culture is just a problem here, and people in these communities expecting the system to work in a way that's pre-Gideon and the Jim Crow era, from the Jim Crow era?
Yeah, I mean, we had a lot of work to do to answer your question, like seriously. But you're right, it wasn't that long ago. I mean, it wasn't. The Jim Crow and all that good stuff, it wasn't that long ago at all. So what we need to do is this. Duplication is one of our biggest problems. And what I mean by that is this. Think about the words that end with T-I-O-N. Incarceration, segregation, gentrification. We can only combat that by education and duplication. We need to duplicate more people in this room who think like-minded to replace these people. Quite frankly, there's no better way of putting that. And so what we have to do is we have to unearth a lot of the fabric of America to you know, to get down to the root of it. And so you're right, these small towns, and you make a great point about these small towns, because that's what it is. These small towns where it's like your daddy was a judge, your uncle's the chief of police, and now you're the town lawyer, so it keeps a cycle going on. So we have to continue to mass produce more people who are like-minded. And I'm not gonna sit up here and tell you that we don't need a criminal justice system, because that's not true. But what we do need is, we need more social than we need criminal justice. That's what we need. And so we have to start to produce more people who think along that lines. And I'll just close by saying this. We had a war on drugs that resulted in mass incarceration. We need to have a war on equality, a war on education, and maybe we can start getting mass educated people, you know, mass people who understand what equality is. And so that's really what we need. We need more people like you asking questions, right? And not just accepting answers, but going off to go do something about it. So thank you for your question.
Let me just say real quick, we're out of time, but let me just say real quick, culture is everything. And that's why the museum in Montgomery, and the memorial to lynching that's there, the fact that kids growing up in Alabama now who've never learned that history ever about slavery and convict leasing and Jim Crow and mass incarceration and sort of the thread that runs throughout that history there are going to start learning about that. Hopefully that's going to help make a change. But I will tell you this, back when we had the 20 public defender offices here in Georgia, the best public defender in the state was Terry Everett's office in Perry, Georgia, a rural circuit in which this woman was just a very dedicated public defender. She hired a bunch of great people to be in her office with her. They developed systems for how when somebody got arrested in Perry, they were at the jail like, within hours of when they got there, and we're getting those people out. So that can be done, because in some places, if it's small enough, one person can make a huge difference, as she did in that place. And so part of what we need to do is be going to those places and trying to turn things around. And it may be easier in places where everybody knows everybody and all that, and particularly the people that we've been talking about who have some, I think the public defender we had up in the mountain circuit at one time here was the son of the governor of Georgia. And obviously he had a certain, resonance that a lot of other people didn't have. He's a judge now, but he was a public defender for a number of years there. So people that can talk the talk and know the people and know the culture and can be a part of it can bring places up like that. That's what I'm saying. We've got to go to these offices and make them better. We've got to go make them better.
Is this my hat, ACS? Yes. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Thank you guys both so much for being on the panel, and thank you all for coming.